New York City in the 1930s was a city of contradictions, glittering nightclubs masking violent rackets, jazz drifting over sidewalks stained with secrets, politicians shaking hands with men they publicly condemned. Smoke curled through dim back rooms where deals were made, envelopes exchanged, and reputations destroyed with a single whisper. Beneath the chaos of the Great Depression, a different kind of economy thrived. One built on vice, fear, and the unspoken understanding that true power did not sit in City Hall, but in the shadows. And at the center of those shadows moved a man the streets spoke of in lowered voices. Lucky Luciano. Impeccably dressed, soft-spoken, always watching. A man who rebuilt the American underworld without ever raising his voice above a whisper. A man who commanded loyalty not through brute force, but through something far more potent: design. He was the quiet architect of modern organized crime, the strategist behind the transformation of scattered gangs into a national syndicate. To the public he was a myth. To politicians a threat. To gangsters a paradox. Approachable, charming, yet untouchable in his authority. But hidden beneath his legendary composure was a truth few understood. Every step toward power carried a price, and the higher he climbed, the more those costs sharpened into danger. A city that needed a king, and feared one before Luciano rose, New York was choking under the weight of its own criminal wars. Ethnic factions clashed over bootlegging routes. Sicilian bosses clung to ancient traditions that crippled progress. Jewish and Irish gangs fought their own battles for influence, often bleeding into Italian turf. Every street corner felt like contested ground. Every night brought rumors of another hit. Luciano saw order where others saw only chaos. He saw potential where others saw ruin. He saw a kingdom waiting for structure. But to build that kingdom he first had to understand its darkness. The fear, the loyalty, the betrayals that shaped every decision in the underworld. Power in his world wasn't about ownership. It was about survival. And survival demanded that he learn to read a room faster than a gun could be drawn. The Whisper Network. Power without announcing it. By the early 1930s, Luciano's influence had seeped into the cracks of the city. Not loudly. Not forcefully. But steadily. Bartenders knew his regular drink before he sat down. Police captains recognized his silhouette before his car door opened. Union leaders lowered their eyes when he entered a room. Even rival gang members felt a quiet shift in the air when his name was mentioned. Curiosity mixed with fear. He didn't need to threaten anyone. His restraint was the threat. The powerful knew he was coming. The desperate hoped he'd come for them. And those who stood in his way often disappeared before he had to act. But what the public didn't see, what the street gossip never captured, was the psychological toll of holding influence in a world where alliances were made with a handshake and broken with a phone call. Luciano trusted almost no one, not even the men closest to him. He understood the mathematics of betrayal. Everyone had a price and everyone had limits. Leadership meant anticipating the moment when loyalty ended. A king built in silence. Luciano never declared himself ruler of the underworld. He didn't need to. The city declared it for him. He reorganized the mafia into families, structured criminal rackets like corporations, and created a governing body that later generations would name with reverence: the Commission. This innovation gave stability to an empire that had been drowning in chaos. But structure invites suspicion. Order invites ambition. And kings, even self-made ones, attract enemies. Luciano understood that becoming the architect of a new system meant becoming its most vulnerable piece. He built barriers around his trust, calculated every alliance, and learned to move through life with the quiet paranoia of someone who knows the knife will not come from a stranger, but from a friend. The central question: what is the cost of power? This story begins not with Luciano's rise, but with the question that haunted him long after he achieved it. What must a man sacrifice to become king in a world built on betrayal? His wealth was vast. His influence unmatched. His reforms legendary. But power in the underworld has no mercy. It demands vigilance, it demands fear, and it demands the understanding that every triumph creates another threat. Lucky Luciano mastered the art of building an empire from shadows, but he also learned that shadows are never still. They shift, they whisper, they conceal enemies, and eventually they swallow even the kings who command them. This is the story of the man who built the modern mafia, and the price he paid for becoming its king. Before Lucky Luciano emerged as the quiet architect of a new criminal order, the American underworld was a battlefield without rules, a fractured network of Sicilian clans, neighborhood gangs, and ambitious tyrants all fighting for scraps of power. It was a world where tradition suffocated innovation, fear replaced strategy, and every decision carried the weight of ancient grudges transplanted from the old country. This was the mafia before Luciano, disorganized, volatile, and destined to implode under the weight of its own chaos. A patchwork of families, no unity, no vision. In the early 1900s, New York's mafia did not resemble the structured machine it would later become. It was a loose web of families, connected not by strategy, but by geography, immigration patterns, and old-world loyalties. Each group was ruled by a don who valued obedience above efficiency. They were not partners. They were not collaborators. They were suspicious rivals trapped in the same city. Every block had its own hierarchy. Every boss had his own customs. Each family guarded its territory with paranoia, believing cooperation would invite betrayal. Profit took a back seat to pride, and stability was treated as weakness. The mafia was not yet an organization. It was a collection of fiefdoms, each with its own king, each king convinced he ruled alone. Old world traditions, a culture that cripples progress. What held these families together wasn't strategy, but Sicilian tradition, a cultural blueprint that made sense in rural villages yet collapsed under the weight of America's booming cities. The traditions demanded blind loyalty, unquestioned obedience, secrecy over communication, violence over negotiation, hierarchy over innovation. These customs bred fear, not unity. Bosses were obeyed but rarely respected. Soldiers carried out orders but rarely understood them. Everyone mistrusted everyone else. The mafia existed in survival mode. It could not grow. It could not adapt. It could only endure. And endurance, in a city changing as rapidly as New York, was a losing battle. Vendettas, the eternal cycle of blood. Perhaps the most crippling force in pre-Luciano mafia culture was the Sicilian vendetta, the belief that every insult, every betrayal, every perceived slight demanded blood. Revenge was not a choice. It was obligation. One killing demanded another. One dispute escalated into a street war. One rumor triggered weeks of retaliatory violence. These vendettas consumed resources, destroyed businesses, and frightened potential allies. More importantly, they blinded bosses to opportunity. Instead of expanding rackets, families defended pride. Instead of building networks, they hunted rivals. Instead of strategizing, they reacted. A system built on revenge could never evolve. It could only burn. Leadership defined by fear. Tyrants in every borough before Luciano, mafia bosses were not statesmen. They were tyrants. Power wasn't something they earned or negotiated, it was something they took by force. Their leadership style shared the same destructive traits. Paranoia disguised as caution, cruelty disguised as strength, impulsive violence disguised as justice. Disloyalty wasn't investigated, it was executed. Mistakes weren't corrected, they were punished. Ambition wasn't nurtured, it was feared. As a result, talented young men were suppressed. Innovative ideas died before reaching the table. Outsiders with skills, Jewish bookmakers, Irish labor racketeers, immigrant entrepreneurs, were dismissed as threats rather than potential partners. The mafia was a stagnant pond, circling the same patterns, repeating the same mistakes. Unstable alliances, partnerships made of sand without structure or shared governance, alliances between families were fragile. A handshake today could become a hit order tomorrow. Agreements lasted only as long as mutual fear outweighed mutual greed. Trust was temporary. Loyalty was conditional. Every meeting risked becoming an ambush. The lack of strategy meant that rivalries spiraled out of control, often over trivial issues. A stolen truckload of whiskey might trigger months of violence. A disputed gambling den could ignite a neighborhood war. Men died not for empire but for ego. New York's underworld wasn't a network, it was a minefield. Chaos without strategy, a system destined to fail. The greatest flaw in the old mafia was its complete lack of long-term vision. No boss thought beyond his own territory. No family planned beyond its next shipment. No leader imagined a future where cooperation could secure greater wealth than conflict. This short-sightedness had consequences. Profits were inconsistent, police attention increased, political protection became unreliable, families weakened themselves through constant conflict. Meanwhile, America itself was changing. Prohibition introduced enormous opportunities for profit, opportunities the old world bosses mishandled with their stubborn refusal to share power or adapt their methods. Instead of dominating the bootlegging market, they fought over it. Instead of building stable supply lines, they hijacked each other's trucks. Instead of forming partnerships, they declared war. The underworld was drowning in potential, but every boss was too busy guarding his pride to grasp it. The tension before transformation, a world waiting for order. By the late 1920s, the mafia was a powder keg. The slightest spark could ignite city-wide conflict. And that spark came in the form of the Castellammares War, the bloody clash that exposed every flaw in the old order. But even before the first shot was fired, something was obvious. The mafia had reached its breaking point. It needed a system. It needed organization. It needed a leader who understood that power meant planning, not posturing. The world before Lucky Luciano was one where control was impossible, profit unstable, and leadership defined by violence rather than vision. It was a world waiting, desperately, for someone to redefine what power looked like. And soon that man would emerge from the shadows. Before he became Lucky Luciano, he was Salvatore Lucania, a skinny boy from Lercarafridi, Sicily, a place defined by poverty, dust, and a silence that carried as much danger as comfort. His family left the old country with a simple hope: survival. But when their ship reached New York Harbor, they stepped not into salvation, but into a different kind of struggle, one that would shape Salvatore's instincts, sharpen his mind, and plant the first seeds of the ambition that would one day redefine the American underworld. From Sicily to the streets, a child immersed in hardship life in Sicily had taught him something valuable. The world did not offer kindness freely. Men worked hard and died young. Women held families together with strength disguised as tenderness. Disputes were settled quietly, often violently, and children were expected to understand the rules without being told. But New York offered a new, harsher education. The Lower East Side was a sprawling jungle of cramped tenements, bustling markets, shouting vendors, and alleyways thick with danger. For immigrants, it was both opportunity and trap. For a young boy who barely spoke English, it was a daily test of endurance. The Lucania family lived shoulder to shoulder with other struggling immigrants, Italians, Jews, Irish, Poles, all competing for the same scraps of work and dignity. Rent was always overdue. Food was unpredictable. Hope was an expensive luxury. Salvatore learned quickly that survival demanded more than honesty and hard work. It required perception. It required timing. It required understanding people before they understood you. Bullying. The first lessons in power. Salvatore's school days were short-lived and bitter. His accent made him a target. His clothes made him an outsider. But it wasn't the bruises from bullying that shaped him, it was the realization behind them. Power belonged to those who could read the intentions of others. He learned to study posture, tone, hesitation. He learned when to stand his ground and when to step back. He learned that fear, once shown, multiplied. And he learned that fighting wasn't just about fists, it was about confidence. Eventually, Salvatore stopped being the boy others pushed around. He became the boy who decided when a fight started and when it ended. Those early moments planted the roots of a skill that would one day make him dangerous: the ability to predict human behavior. Street hustles. Discovering a talent for organization by age 10, Salvatore drifted from school into the rhythms of street life. He shined shoes for pennies. He delivered packages for store owners who trusted him because he was quiet and quick. He watched older boys run scams, dice games, and petty theft rings, and what fascinated him wasn't the crime but the structure. The hustle wasn't random. It was organized chaos. Someone collected bets. Someone enforced rules. Someone settled disputes. Even in the alleys of the Lower East Side, Salvatore saw hierarchy. He noticed who earned respect and who earned fear. He saw how loyalty worked, and how easily it broke when money was involved. He wasn't drawn to crime because of greed. He was drawn to the system behind it. The first taste of underworld reality by his early teens, Salvatore was doing small jobs for neighborhood gangsters. Carrying messages. Delivering packages he never asked about. Standing watch outside gambling dens. He learned the codes of the street long before he understood the laws of the country. He saw men get beaten for speaking out of turn. He saw deals made with a handshake and broken with a stare. He saw how quickly a friend could become a threat. Everything reinforced one rule: trust sparingly, observe everything. This was the beginning of the psychological framework that would define Lucky Luciano. Power through understanding, not force. Meyer Lansky, the first true ally. One afternoon, during a street scuffle between Italian and Jewish boys, Salvatore noticed someone who fought differently. A wiry kid with sharp eyes and a calm expression, Meyer Lansky. While others swung wildly, Lansky moved with calculation. He didn't fight harder, he fought smarter. Salvatore recognized something familiar, this boy thought. After the fight, the two exchanged wary glances. That was the beginning of one of the most important alliances in American criminal history. Lansky understood numbers like second nature. He saw patterns, odds, and outcomes in ways that impressed even adults. Salvatore meanwhile saw people, their motivations, fears and weaknesses. Together they formed a partnership built not on ethnicity, but on mutual respect and ambition. Lansky showed Salvatore that violence was the least sophisticated form of power. Salvatore showed Lansky that leadership required psychology as much as intelligence. And for the first time, Salvatore realized he didn't need to just survive the streets. He could master them. Bugsy Siegel, fire to balance the ice. Not long after, Lansky introduced Salvatore to his other close friend, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, a volatile whirlwind of charisma and aggression. If Lansky was calculation, Siegel was instinct. He acted first and questioned later, unafraid of anyone or anything. Salvatore admired Siegel's fearlessness, even when it bordered on recklessness. Because in Siegel he saw a vital component of power, the willingness to enforce decisions when diplomacy failed. Together the trio created balance. Salvatore, later Luciano, strategist, reader of men; Lansky, mathematician, architect of systems; Siegel, enforcer, embodiment of intimidation. These friendships taught Salvatore the most important lesson of his young life. Power is built with people, the right people. Not through fear alone, but through a combination of trust, talent, and shared ambition. The seeds of ambition, rising above the chaos. As Salvatore entered his late teens, the world around him felt too small. The petty fights, the street scams, the neighborhood bosses, none of it seemed worthy of the effort. He began to dream beyond tenement walls, beyond the narrow confines of ethnic turf wars. Why settle for scraps when the entire city was divided by fools fighting over pennies? Why accept chaos when structure could make everyone richer? Why obey tyrants when he could outthink them? The boy who once dodged bullies had become a young man with vision, a man who saw New York not as a battleground, but as a map of opportunities. In those early years, Salvatore Lucania learned the most important rule of survival: you don't wait for a kingdom. You build one. Soon, the world would know him by another name, a name born not from luck, but from the instincts he learned on the streets. Lucky Luciano. By the mid-1920s, the boy who once dodged bullies in the Lower East Side had become something far more dangerous. A man capable of reading the entire underworld like a chessboard. Lucky Luciano had shed the rough skin of a street enforcer and stepped into a new identity: strategist, negotiator, architect. The criminal world was still brutal, unpredictable, and divided by ethnic lines, but Luciano saw potential where others only saw threats. He didn't want to rule the mafia through intimidation. He wanted to reshape it. From muscle to mind, a shift in purpose. Most gangsters rose through violence. Luciano rose through observation. He understood that fear alone could not sustain an empire. Strength invited challengers. Brutality created enemies. But strategy, true strategy, created longevity. Luciano could still fight when necessary, but he no longer relied on fists or guns. Instead, he used timing, negotiation, alliances, psychology, structure. He realized the underworld did not need another tyrant. It needed a system. This shift separated him from the old generation of mafia leaders, men stuck in Sicilian tradition, relying on revenge and rigid hierarchy. Luciano wanted something more efficient, more profitable, and far more modern. Modernizing the operation. Bringing order to chaos. Luciano's first step was to introduce organization into an underworld that operated on impulse. He studied how corporations were run, how departments communicated, how managers delegated, how profits circulated. If legitimate businesses could function smoothly across states, why couldn't criminal ones? He began restructuring rackets with quiet precision. Streamlined bootlegging routes, appointed managers for gambling dens, created accounting systems for consistent profit tracking, enforced schedules, territories, and responsibilities. He turned chaos into efficiency. He turned rackets into industrial pipelines. And in doing so, he created something the mafia had never seen before: predictability. Cross-ethnic alliances. A revolutionary decision at a time when most Italian bosses refused to work with anyone outside their heritage. Luciano did the unthinkable. He forged alliances with Jewish and Irish crime figures. Not as subordinates, not as temporary partners, but as equals. He trusted Meyer Lansky's mathematical brilliance. He trusted Bugsy Siegel's fearless enforcement. He collaborated with Arnold Rothstein's network of fixers, bookmakers, and financiers. Luciano didn't care about bloodlines. He cared about capability. To him, talent was more valuable than tradition. This made him enemies among the Sicilian old guard, but it also gave him access to resources, intelligence, and manpower that no one else possessed. These alliances weren't just partnerships. They were foundational pillars of the empire he was building. A hierarchy built like a corporation. Luciano rebuilt the mafia's internal structure with the same clarity he brought to his rackets. Instead of the outdated model of one tyrant controlling everything, he created a system based on functional roles. Boss, strategic decision-maker under boss, operations manager consigliere, advisor and mediator capo regimes, regional managers soldiers, field operators. Not only did this improve efficiency, it reduced conflict. Men understood their responsibilities. Orders flowed downward. Information flowed upward. Disputes were resolved through mediation rather than bullets. For the first time, the mafia looked less like a clan, and more like a corporation. The psychological cost of leadership, but rising to the top comes with a price, and Luciano paid it daily. Power demanded constant vigilance. A single misstep could turn allies into threats. A moment of weakness could spark a coup. Luciano knew the underworld respected strength, but feared intelligence even more. He slept lightly. He trusted carefully. He planned obsessively. There were nights when he walked alone along the Hudson River, replaying conversations, analyzing expressions, calculating risks. He wondered whether modernization would anger the wrong man, or whether an ally might decide ambition mattered more than loyalty. The mind of a strategist rarely rests. Luciano's never did. A network built on influence, not intimidation. What truly distinguished Luciano from the old bosses was his ability to make men want to follow him. He didn't bully his allies, he empowered them. He offered stability, profit, and protection. His leadership felt less like dictatorship and more like partnership. Still, he knew influence was fragile. Respect could evaporate. Loyalty could shift. Fear could backfire. So he built relationships with care, nurtured alliances strategically, and kept the most dangerous men close enough to study but far enough to control. He mastered the psychology of leadership, understanding that people stayed loyal not because of threats but because of opportunity. Sacrifice, the price of an empire. As Luciano rose, the sacrifices mounted. He distanced himself from family to keep them safe. He buried friendships to maintain neutrality. He hardened parts of himself he once protected fiercely. He learned that a leader in the underworld could have influence or intimacy, never both. His vision demanded emotional isolation, even from the men he trusted most. The empire he built required pieces of him the public never saw. The man becoming the myth. By the early 1930s, Luciano was no longer just a rising figure. He was becoming the center of gravity within the underworld, the quiet force holding wildly different factions together. He had evolved from a street kid into a strategist, from a hustler into an organizer, from a fighter into an architect. And though the world would one day call him a king, Luciano knew the truth. He wasn't ruling with strength. He was ruling with structure. The empire he built would outlive him. But every inch of progress came with a cost he had already begun to pay. Long before Lucky Luciano began reshaping the American underworld, he inherited a rule older than any street, any racket, any boss. Omerta, the sacred code of silence. In Sicily, Omerta had been a way of life, a cultural shield against police, outsiders, and betrayal. In America, it became something even more powerful, a psychological weapon, a test of loyalty, and a burden that pressed on every man who dared to climb the mafia's ranks. For Luciano, Omerta was both armor and chain. It protected him from enemies. It bound him to allies he didn't fully trust. It forced him to create bonds in a world where betrayal was currency. Silence as survival. The first lesson in power from his earliest days on the Lower East Side, Luciano understood that silence was not a passive act. It was an act of control. The quiet boy survived. The loud boy attracted danger. Silence meant secrets, secrets meant leverage, and leverage meant power. But Omerta was more than staying quiet. It demanded emotional discipline. It demanded loyalty without hesitation. It demanded that a man choose death over confession. For the old Sicilian bosses, this rule was sacred. For Luciano, it was something else, a tool he could sharpen. He recognized that Omerta unified men who otherwise hated each other. It created a shared fear, and shared fear is a powerful glue. The same silence that terrified outsiders gave insiders a sense of belonging. Luciano embraced this duality. He didn't weaken Omerta. He perfected it. Enforcing loyalty, a leader's constant balancing act. Luciano knew that in the mafia, respect alone was insufficient. Fear alone was dangerous. A leader needed both, but balanced with something deeper, predictability. Men followed him because he made the world less chaotic, not because he intimidated them into obedience. But Omerta demanded enforcement. If someone broke the code, discipline had to be absolute. A whisper to police, a careless confession, an exposed secret. Any of these could unravel the entire structure Luciano had built. Still, he hated unnecessary brutality. Violence for tradition's sake meant nothing to him. Violence for protection meant everything. When soldiers talked too much, Luciano reminded them of consequences through measured, strategic punishment. He didn't need theatrics. A quiet warning carried more weight. A glance from Luciano could silence a room. He rarely raised his voice, because in a world ruled by omerta, silence itself spoke volumes. The paranoia embedded in the culture, but enforcing omerta came with a price: constant vigilance. In the old mafia, paranoia was tradition. For Luciano, it became an occupational hazard. Every man around him had sworn loyalty, but loyalty was fluid, shaped by fear, money, ambition, or survival. He knew soldiers lied to impress him. He knew lieutenants withheld truths to protect themselves. He knew allies kept secrets, because secret-keeping was the underworld's true currency. Every day Luciano asked himself the same question: who can I trust? And the answer was always complicated. Trust meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant risk. Risk in his world meant death. To maintain power, he needed people close enough to carry out his vision, but not close enough to destroy him. Omerta as a psychological weapon. Luciano realized early that the most powerful men were not the ones who shouted orders, but the ones whose silence made others nervous. He used omerta not just as a rule but as a strategic force. When he withheld information, men scrambled to interpret his intentions. When he responded cautiously, they feared they had disappointed him. When he approved something with a nod, it felt like a rare blessing. This emotional control wasn't accidental, it was mastery. In a world where everyone feared betrayal, Luciano played into that fear elegantly. His silence made him unpredictable yet dependable. Allies respected him because he didn't expose weaknesses. Rivals feared him because they couldn't read him. And through omerta, Luciano shaped one of the most effective psychological atmospheres in crime history. Speak only what strengthens the structure. Hide everything that weakens it. The burden of trust. A king surrounded by doubt. Every leader carries weight, but Luciano carried more than power. He carried a contradiction. He needed loyalty to survive, and loyalty required trust, but trust could kill him. This internal conflict haunted him more than rival bosses ever did. He formed alliances with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel because they were the only men he believed understood ambition without greed. But even then, trust was never absolute. Trust was situational. Trust was earned daily. Luciano often stayed awake long after meetings, replaying conversations word for word. Was a pause suspicious? Was a compliment too eager? Did a favor signal loyalty or manipulation? He built the commission to distribute leadership, but even that demanded trust. He had to believe the bosses would follow rules. He had to trust them to prioritize profit over ego. And he had to hope they feared instability more than they coveted domination. Leadership in the mafia wasn't simply about making decisions. It was about navigating a minefield of promises, knowing one wrong step could end everything. Omerta as burden, the rule that consumed its keeper. Omerta made Luciano powerful. Omerta made him respected. Omerta made his empire possible. But it also isolated him. He could not confide in weakness. He could not share fear. He could not admit exhaustion. Because the moment a king reveals doubt, the wolves gather. In the end, silence protected him, but it also imprisoned him. Luciano became the embodiment of omerta, a man who carved power from secrecy but quietly suffered under its weight. And as the world around him grew more dangerous, the very rule that elevated him would become the rule that demanded he stand alone. Before Luciano, crime in New York was a patchwork of hustles, small-time gambling corners, disorganized brothels, unpredictable bootlegging routes, and neighborhood toughs fighting over scraps of influence. But Luciano didn't see fragments. He saw systems waiting to be shaped, industries waiting to be built, and profits waiting to be organized into something far larger than any one man. He didn't turn crime into chaos. He turned chaos into industry. His genius lay not in brutality, but in structure, transforming the underworld into a multi-layered economy with predictable revenue, distributed labor, and decentralized control. Gambling, the beating heart of the syndicate. Gambling was the first operation Luciano reshaped. Before him, gambling dens were unreliable, violent, and prone to collapse under police pressure. Bookmakers cheated customers, street managers pocketed profits, and territorial disputes led to unnecessary bloodshed. Luciano approached gambling the way a businessman approaches a corporation, Centralized oversight, standardized odds and payouts, trusted lieutenants to manage neighborhoods, scheduled pickups for revenue streams, quiet agreements with police and politicians, with Meyer Lansky providing mathematical precision. Luciano crafted a gambling network where every dice game, card table, and numbers racket fit into a larger machine. Bookmakers no longer acted independently, they operated as branches of a well-managed franchise. Money flowed upward reliably. Violence dropped. Trust in the brand increased. For the first time, the mafia had a revenue stream that behaved like a legitimate business, steady, coordinated, and scalable. Prostitution, turning disorder into structure. While prostitution would later become the legal hammer that helped bring him down, Luciano's approach to the industry was revolutionary. Before him, prostitution rings were scattered operations controlled by volatile pimps and madams. Violence was constant. Profits were unpredictable. Police raids tore businesses apart weekly. Luciano brought order. District managers replaced individual pimps, protection fees were standardized, earnings were organized into tiers, brothels were connected through communication networks, girls were moved strategically to avoid police patterns. His innovation was decentralization. No single brothel held enough importance to expose the whole system. If police raided one house, operations elsewhere continued untouched. It was the first criminal supply chain, and its sophistication stunned law enforcement when they finally discovered it. The irony, of course, is that this order would one day become the prosecution's greatest argument against him. Narcotics, the quiet, dangerous frontier. Luciano entered the narcotics trade cautiously, understanding its enormous profit potential and its enormous risk. Narcotics drew federal attention, carried long prison sentences, and attracted reckless dealers whose carelessness could ruin everything. So he designed a layered structure to minimize exposure. International contacts in Europe and the Middle East, couriers who knew only their immediate tasks, distribution managers who insulated top leaders, local dealers who never saw the pipeline's origin. Each layer acted independently. If one link broke, the rest remained intact. Luciano didn't dominate narcotics. He structured it so effectively that others could run it safely. His approach transformed heroin and cocaine trafficking from isolated smuggling attempts into an organized, sustainable business. The old bosses saw narcotics as poison. Luciano saw it as engineering. Labor racketeering, power hidden in plain sight. If gambling and narcotics brought money, labor racketeering brought influence, and influence was the true currency of the underworld. By infiltrating unions, Luciano discovered he could control critical industries. Docks, trucking routes, construction, garment factories, shipping warehouses. Unions became the perfect leverage points. A threatened strike could freeze commerce. A delayed shipment could alter entire markets. A quiet payoff could keep everything running smoothly. Through these unions, Luciano controlled not only criminals, but businessmen, politicians, and municipal power brokers. The legitimate and illegitimate economies blurred until they became mutually dependent. Labor racketeering wasn't glamorous, but it was powerful. It made Luciano unavoidable. The genius of decentralization, reducing risk, increasing control. Luciano's greatest innovation wasn't any single racket. It was the way he structured the entire underworld. He decentralized authority so skillfully that no boss controlled every racket, no capo understood the entire map, no soldier had access to big-picture strategy. Everyone had a role. Everyone had limits. Everyone had incentive to protect their piece of the system. Luciano became the quiet center of gravity, not through force but through architecture. This decentralization made betrayal harder, prosecution nearly impossible, and expansion limitless. It also meant that the system could operate even if he wasn't physically present at every decision. But decentralization had a darker consequence Luciano could not ignore. The larger the empire became, the more catastrophic its collapse would be. Accumulating control, quietly, incrementally, relentlessly. Luciano never declared himself king. He allowed others to name him that, a far safer arrangement. He didn't seize rackets, he improved them until bosses relied on him. He didn't demand loyalty, his strategy earned it. He didn't start wars, he prevented them with negotiation. Control came not through conquest but through necessity. Men needed Luciano because the system functioned better with him at its center. But the quiet consolidation of power carried emotional weight. More responsibility, more enemies, more scrutiny, more nights spent reading danger in every silence. Luciano understood that he was building something grand, but also something fragile. An empire too visible in its success would eventually draw the eyes he least wanted. The stakes rise, power becomes a trap. As Luciano's criminal industries matured into a multi-layered syndicate, the stakes grew with each passing year. He held influence over more people than he could personally monitor. Profit surged, but so did risk. He was no longer just managing operations, he was managing an ecosystem. Power became both shield and burden. Structure became both protection and vulnerability. Growth became both triumph and threat. The empire he built made him untouchable, and simultaneously painted a target on his back. And soon, the world outside the underworld would take notice. For Lucky Luciano, building an empire wasn't just about organizing rackets. It was about managing men, each one dangerous in a different way. The underworld was a landscape of volatile personalities, shifting alliances, and ambitions that simmered beneath polite smiles. Luciano's genius was not simply his strategy, but his ability to read these men with surgical precision and guide them like pieces on a board. He understood the unspoken truth of the mafia. Violence was loud, but power was quiet. And in that silence, a war for control was always unfolding. A war Luciano navigated with diplomacy, manipulation, and calculation sharper than any blade. Joe Masuria, the old-world tyrant blocking the future Joe, the boss, Masuria ruled his organization with brute force, superstition, and an iron grip on old Sicilian traditions. To Masuria, power meant fear. Loyalty meant obedience. Innovation meant betrayal. He could not imagine a mafia that cooperated across ethnic lines, nor one that valued intelligence over intimidation. Masuria saw Luciano as talented, but too modern, too willing to bend rules that Masuria considered sacred. For Luciano, the problem wasn't Masuria's power, it was his limitations. Masuria's outdated thinking suffocated progress and risked plunging the mafia into endless, pointless wars. Luciano played a dangerous game. He acted loyal. He acted grateful. He acted obedient. But internally he studied Masuria the way a strategist studies a dying empire. He knew Masuria's reign could not last. The old boss could not coexist with the new structure Luciano envisioned. Luciano didn't want Masuria's throne. He wanted to abolish the idea of a throne. Salvatore Maranzano, the strategist who wanted to be Caesar when the Castellamarese War erupted, Luciano found himself between two titans, Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Unlike Masuria, Maranzano was educated, organized, and strategic. He appreciated Luciano's intelligence, even admired it. But admiration can be another form of threat. Maranzano didn't want modernization. He wanted domination. He wanted to be the boss of bosses. He wanted total control disguised as order. To Maranzano, Luciano was both asset and competitor. Someone to groom, flatter, and eventually eliminate. Luciano recognized this instinct immediately. He read it in Maranzano's posture, his carefully chosen words, his attempts to shape Luciano into an obedient successor. Maranzano's brilliance made him more dangerous than Masuria. You can predict a tyrant. You cannot predict a strategist who sees you as both prize and threat. Luciano used charm and diplomacy to stay close, listening, learning, waiting. He played the role of dutiful lieutenant with Oscar-worthy precision, knowing the final act would require betrayal to prevent his own destruction. Vito Genovese, the ambitious shadow in his own camp. If Masuria represented the past and Maranzano represented dangerous intellect, Vito Genovese represented something closer, more intimate, and far more personal, a rival growing inside Luciano's own circle. Genovese was intelligent, loyal when it benefited him, and ruthlessly ambitious. He admired Luciano's reforms, yet envied the respect Luciano commanded. He watched Luciano with the eyes of a man who believed he could do the job better. His loyalty was conditional, calculated, and always pointed toward opportunity. Luciano understood Genovese in a way only equals can. He knew Genovese's ambition could one day turn inward. He knew Genovese's silence meant plotting, not obedience. He knew the man was waiting for a moment of vulnerability. But unlike Masuria or Maranzano, Luciano couldn't simply remove Genovese. Genovese was too embedded, too useful, too connected. Handling Genovese required a subtler approach. Give him responsibility. Give him influence. But never give him enough power to become indispensable. It was a delicate balance, the kind that kept Luciano awake at night. Dutch Schultz, the wild card who could burn everything down while Masuria and Maranzano posed structured threats. Dutch Schultz was something else entirely, chaos in human form. Schultz was violent, unpredictable, and allergic to discipline. He didn't respect the commission, didn't care about diplomacy, and didn't understand strategy. He respected only money and mayhem. Schultz's instability threatened not just Luciano, but the entire underworld. When he wanted to assassinate prosecutor Thomas Dewey, a move that would have triggered a government crackdown, Luciano had to make one of the hardest decisions of his life: side with the wild card and risk total collapse, or eliminate him and prevent a catastrophe. Luciano chose stability over sentiment. It wasn't personal. It was mathematical. By removing Schultz, Luciano protected the future of organized crime, and reinforced the silent truth that guided all his decisions. No man, no matter how powerful, could be allowed to endanger the system. Diplomacy, manipulation, and silent calculation. Luciano's real weapons. Luciano's rise was not won through gunfire, but through perception. He knew when to flatter, when to threaten, when to wait, when to strike. He mastered the art of the non-answer, the art of the quiet pause, the art of making a man believe he was part of the plan, even when he was being maneuvered out of the way. For Masuria, he played the obedient soldier. For Maranzano, he played the promising protege. For Genovese, he played the wary mentor. For Schultz, he played the cautious ally. Luciano crafted a different version of himself for each man, not out of deception but out of survival. The quiet war for control wasn't fought with bullets. It was fought with conversation, intuition, and the psychology of power. The unspoken truth: Luciano's burden managing these men required intelligence, restraint, and emotional discipline few leaders possessed. Luciano had to predict danger before it surfaced. He had to maintain alliances that drained him. He had to smile at men he knew wanted him dead. His empire depended on balance, and balance depended on him never slipping. Each handshake was a calculation. Each alliance was a risk. Each decision was a potential betrayal waiting to unfold. But in this quiet war, Luciano had one advantage none of the others possessed. He saw the world not as a battlefield, but as a system. And systems, once understood, can be controlled. The Castellamares War didn't begin with a single gunshot. It began with a feeling, a pressure building beneath the surface of New York's underworld. 4 years, tensions between Joe Masuria's faction and the rising Castellamares clan had simmered, but by 1930 the heat became unbearable. What erupted was not merely a feud, but a full-scale civil war that threatened to destroy the mafia before it ever truly formed. For Lucky Luciano, the war was more than violence. It was a test of loyalty, psychology, and survival. It was the moment he realized that to build the future he might have to betray the past. A war of old men, and a young man caught between them. Masuria believed he owned Luciano. To him, Luciano was a promising asset, a smart soldier who would eventually inherit the old Sicilian ways. But the opposing leader, Salvatore Maranzano, saw Luciano differently, not as a pupil, but as a potential successor to a new vision of organized crime. Luciano understood a truth neither man wanted to admit: the war wasn't about territory. It was about ideology. But he also understood the risk. Choosing sides too early could get him killed. Choosing wrong could end the modern mafia before it began. So he positioned himself between the two, an uneasy balance that required charm, deception, and constant vigilance. Masuria demanded loyalty. Maranzano expected intelligence. Luciano gave both men exactly what they wanted, just enough to stay alive. Assassination plots, the quiet conversations that could end a life. The war brought daily bloodshed. Soldiers disappeared. Businesses burned. Streets filled with whispers. Luciano watched alliances break like brittle glass under pressure. He also felt the noose tightening around him. Both sides questioned his loyalty because he refused to commit fully. Every meeting became a psychological battlefield. Every handshake carried suspicion. Every compliment disguised interrogation. The first plot Luciano learned about was Masuria's. The old boss had grown paranoid, convinced that Luciano's open-minded approach meant treachery. He ordered Luciano to eliminate several men who opposed him, a test of loyalty Luciano barely passed. But then came the other whisper: Maranzano wanted Luciano dead as well. To Maranzano, Luciano was too close to Masuria. To Masuria, Luciano was too modern for Sicilian rule. To both he was a threat. The war forced him to confront an impossible truth: survival might require betrayal. The kidnapping, a message written in pain. One night in 1929, Luciano vanished. Kidnapped, beaten, stabbed, left for dead on Staten Island. Newspapers speculated wildly. Masuria blamed Maranzano. Maranzano blamed Masuria. Luciano said nothing. But the beating left more than scars on his face. It carved a deeper belief into his mind: the old world could not survive in America. Its rules were outdated. Its leaders were reckless. Its traditions were killing the very organization they claimed to protect. As he recovered, Luciano shifted from observer to strategist. The war wasn't something he could hide from anymore. It was something he needed to end. Turning the war into opportunity, Luciano approached the conflict with the cold logic of a chess master. He studied the strengths and weaknesses of both bosses. He noted their paranoia, their desperation, and the fragility of their alliances. Where they saw loyalty as absolute, Luciano saw leverage. Where they saw betrayal, he saw restructuring. He realized the war could achieve something neither Masuria nor Maranzano intended: the destruction of the old system. But ending the war required a decision that carried immense emotional cost. He would have to remove both men who sought to control him. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't ambition. It was necessity. Luciano wasn't choosing himself. He was choosing the future of the mafia. The betrayal of Masuria, a calculated death in 1931, Luciano made the first move. He met with Maranzano's representatives and agreed to eliminate Masuria in exchange for peace and restructuring. It was not a choice he celebrated. Masuria, despite his flaws, had once been a mentor. But the war had warped the old boss into a danger even to his own men. On a quiet afternoon in Coney Island, Luciano excused himself from a card game. Minutes later, hitmen entered and killed Masuria. The war shifted immediately. For the first time in years, silence fell across New York's underworld. But the silence wasn't relief. It was anticipation. Luciano knew Maranzano expected full control. He knew the war wasn't truly over. He knew the second betrayal was coming. Maranzano's ambition. The new tyrant Maranzano crowned himself boss of bosses. He reorganized territories. He demanded tribute. He summoned capos daily. He ordered body searches for men he claimed to trust. Luciano saw the same mistake Masuria had made. Absolute power always destroys itself. If Maranzano completed his consolidation, Luciano, and the modern mafia, would be trapped under another tyrant. Once again, Luciano chose the future over the present. The second betrayal, ending the old world for good in September 1931, Luciano orchestrated the assassination of Maranzano. Hitmen posing as government agents entered Maranzano's office and ended his reign before it fully began. The Castellamarese War was over. But Luciano carried the emotional weight of what he had done. He had betrayed two bosses. He had broken two codes. He had chosen vision over loyalty, and that choice left scars no one could see. The internal cost. The war. Luciano never spoke about. The world celebrated Luciano's rise, but he carried the war inside him. He had ordered deaths not out of ambition but out of survival. He had navigated shifting allegiances knowing any misstep could lead to his own execution. He had walked through blood to reach a future only he believed in. The Castellamarese War gave Luciano power, but it took something from him too. It hardened him. It isolated him. It transformed him from a strategist into a necessary betrayer, a role he never embraced publicly but privately accepted as the cost of evolution. The hidden war ended with Luciano atop a new order. But the scars beneath that victory would follow him for the rest of his life. When the final echoes of the Castellamarese War faded and the blood dried on New York streets, Lucky Luciano emerged as the man who ended the chaos. For the first time in mafia history, the families were unified under a structure that prioritized strategy over ego, profit over vendetta, and cooperation over tyranny. It was a victory that reshaped organized crime, and a victory that came with a cost Luciano could feel in every cautious breath he took. He had torn down the old world. He had built a new one. But now he had to defend it, against enemies who feared him, against allies who envied him, and against the system he himself had created. A new order, and the birth of a new fear. With Masuria and Maranzano gone, Luciano implemented his vision. The Commission, a governing body that abolished the role of bosses, and replaced dictatorship with shared authority. Each family had a seat. Each leader had a voice. Disputes were settled through negotiation. Territory was respected. Profit was shared. It was brilliant, efficient, necessary, and to many bosses terrifying. The older generation saw the new system not as stability but as betrayal. Tradition had been shattered. Power had been redistributed. The Sicilian hierarchy they worshipped was gone, replaced by something modern, something American. To them, Luciano wasn't a reformer. He was a traitor with too much influence. Their resentment simmered beneath polite meetings and staged compliments. They smiled at him, praised him, even thanked him, all while imagining what might happen if Luciano ever stumbled. The invisible crown, and its weight. Luciano refused the title of supreme leader, but the world crowned him anyway. His fingerprints were on every decision the Commission made. Every dispute settled. Every racket expanded. Even when he kept silent, men waited for his reaction. Power gathered around him naturally. And with power came paranoia. Luciano felt it in rooms where conversations stopped abruptly when he entered. He felt it in the glances exchanged between conservative bosses. He felt it when he realized men were measuring not just his influence, but their willingness to tolerate it. Victory had given him authority. Authority had given him enemies. He slept lightly, drank carefully, trusted selectively. He analyzed every compliment as if it were a coded threat. He understood that in a world built on alliances, loyalty was temporary and ambition eternal. Traditionalists, the men who wanted the past back, some bosses believed Luciano had broken the sacred foundation of the mafia. They resented his cross-ethnic partnerships, his collaboration with Jewish and Irish figures, his emphasis on business over tradition, his dismissal of old-world customs. Men like Vincent Mangano and Joe Prophesy whispered in corners, shaking their heads at the Americanization of Cosa Nostra. They respected Luciano's intelligence but feared its consequences. They saw the future he created, and they hated that they had no place in it. To them, Luciano was not a leader. He was a disruptor. A danger disguised as progress. Luciano knew their anger was quiet only because they needed time to find courage or opportunity. The ambitious shadows. Genovese waits, but no threat concerned Luciano more than Vito Genovese. Genovese had once been a loyal ally, a man who stood beside Luciano during the war. But loyalty in the underworld was often rooted in opportunity, not conviction. And now that Luciano sat atop a system he created, Genovese's ambition had room to grow. Genovese saw himself as the rightful heir. He saw Luciano's diplomacy as weakness. He saw the new structure as something he could someday manipulate. To Genovese, patience was strategy. To Luciano, patience was warning. Their conversations were polite, their collaborations productive. But beneath the surface, each man analyzed the other with the cold understanding that one day, ambition and authority might collide. Allies become observers. Even friends questioned power. Even Luciano's closest allies watched his growing influence with complicated emotions. Frank Costello admired him, but understood that visibility brought danger. Meyer Lansky supported him, but feared Luciano's name was becoming too big. Bugsy Siegel remained loyal, but questioned whether the structure would survive outside New York. They didn't resent Luciano, they worried for him. But worry can feel like doubt, and doubt can feel like distance. Luciano began to sense subtle changes. Fewer unsolicited conversations, more cautious questions, more reminders that leadership should be shared. Not because they wanted to weaken him, but because they knew the spotlight could attract threats from far beyond the underworld. Power amplifies danger. The psychological reality: the mafia had never been more stable than under Luciano's influence. Yet he had never felt more vulnerable. Because in the underworld, success is as dangerous as failure. Every step forward created new enemies. Every reform removed someone's advantage. Every victory left a trail of resentment. Luciano often walked New York streets silently, replaying the war in his mind, not the violence but the choices. He wondered if eliminating Masuria and Maranzano had also eliminated barriers that kept ambitious men like Genovese or Schultz from acting recklessly. He had ended one war. But in doing so, he had opened the door to 100 smaller ones, whispered, hidden, waiting for a moment of weakness. The pressure builds. The government takes notice. The underworld wasn't the only place where danger grew. Law enforcement began to study the structure Luciano built, noting how efficiently it operated, how profits rose, and how cooperation reduced violence. Prosecutors saw not random crimes but organization. Not street fights but economics. The more unified the mafia became, the more clearly the government saw it. Luciano sensed this shift before anyone else. He read the newspapers with the same intensity he read the eyes of rivals. He recognized the patterns: investigative committees forming, journalists digging deeper, politicians hungry for headlines. The empire he created was beginning to show under the light. Victory becomes a trap. Luciano's success gave him everything he once dreamed of: order, wealth, respect. But it also created a trap he couldn't escape. He couldn't slow down without showing weakness. He couldn't retreat without surrendering control. He couldn't trust fully without risking betrayal. He couldn't grow the empire without attracting more enemies. Power had elevated him. Power now threatened him. Power, he realized, was never a destination, it was a battlefield. And though the war for New York was over, a new war, silent, psychological, relentless, was just beginning. For years, Lucky Luciano had built his empire in the shadows. The brilliance of his system lay in its invisibility: decentralized rackets, compartmentalized authority, and a governing commission that hid individual responsibility behind collective decisions. But as the underworld stabilized and profits soared, something else rose with it: attention. Newspapers began printing rumors of a mastermind behind the mafia's new order, a quiet figure whose intelligence made him more dangerous than any gunman. Soon the whispers had a name. And the name was Lucky Luciano. The public needs a villain, and finds one in the mid-1930s. America hungered for someone to blame for its vices. Gambling dens, prostitution rings, narcotics, corrupt unions, these weren't isolated problems anymore. They seemed coordinated, structured, industrial. The public sensed an unseen hand guiding the underworld, and stories began to circulate about a man who had turned crime into something resembling a corporation. Journalists described Luciano as the underworld's prime minister, the silent king of crime, the man who made the mafia efficient. Most of it was exaggeration, but it didn't matter. A myth had formed, and myths attract crusaders. Luciano had built a structure meant to hide him. Ironically, it illuminated him instead. The political climate changes. Reformers hungry for a battle. New York was growing tired of corruption. Citizens were outraged by stories of brothels protected by police, unions sabotaged by mobsters, and judges bought by underworld money. The city demanded reform. It demanded justice. It demanded a symbol of victory over vice. Politicians saw their opportunity. Ambition found its enemy. They didn't want to dismantle the mafia. That was too complex. They wanted to topple the man they believed represented it. Luciano had become the face of a system that, ironically, was designed to have no face at all. Enter Thomas Dewey, a prosecutor with something to prove. Thomas E. Dewey was young, determined, and brilliant. But more importantly, he was politically ambitious. He understood that taking down street-level criminals earned applause. Taking down a national crime figure earned legacy. Dewey studied Luciano's structure with the intensity of a general preparing for war. He realized that the key wasn't proving Luciano personally committed crimes, it was proving he led a system that enabled them. Dewey wasn't chasing facts alone. He was building a narrative. To him, Luciano was the embodiment of organized vice, and he needed a villain that large to catapult his own career. Dewey didn't want Luciano arrested. He wanted Luciano destroyed. Pressure begins to build. Luciano feels the walls tighten. Luciano had survived mob wars, betrayal, and assassination plots. But government pressure felt different. It was quieter, colder, more methodical. He noticed unfamiliar detectives watching from doorways, friends questioned by police, reporters writing about him as if he were already convicted, judges discussing vice kingpins, without naming him, politicians promising a crackdown on the Luciano system. It was the first time Luciano realized his true enemy wasn't a rival boss or an unstable gangster. It was a government that now understood the scale of what he had built. This spotlight wasn't admiration. It was preparation. Dewey's strategy: break the foundation, not the man. Dewey understood something the old Sicilian bosses never did. Luciano's power wasn't in violence, it was in influence. So Dewey attacked the parts of the empire Luciano didn't touch personally but shaped strategically. The brothels, the gambling houses, the union payoffs, the underground financial networks. He raided brothels and arrested prostitutes, not because he cared about vice, but because they were Luciano's weakest link. They were scared, vulnerable, and far removed from the loyalty expected of mafia soldiers. Dewey crafted a case built not on physical evidence, but on testimony, fear, and public outrage. Luciano saw it unfolding. And for the first time in his life, he felt a threat he couldn't negotiate with. Enemies shift. The law replaces the mob. In the past, Luciano's enemies tried to shoot him. Now they tried to define him. The old world of assassinations and turf wars felt almost nostalgic compared to the new threat. A bullet Luciano could see coming. A prosecutor he could not. Traditional mafia rivals suddenly looked small compared to the machinery of the state. Masuria and Maranzano had been dangerous but predictable. Dewey was something else. A man whose ambition created a danger Luciano couldn't reason with or intimidate. This was a war fought in courtrooms, not alleyways. With testimonies, not Tommy guns. With headlines, not hit squads. And Luciano, for all his intelligence, had never fought on this battlefield before. The psychological shift. Power no longer felt like power as the spotlight intensified. Luciano felt something he had never truly felt, even during the Castellamarese War. He was losing control. Not of his men, they remained loyal. Not of his structure, it still functioned. But of the narrative. The public now believed he ran every racket. The newspapers believed he ruled the entire mafia. Dewey believed he was the mastermind he sought to defeat. The truth didn't matter. Perception had become reality. Luciano had built a system that thrived in secrecy, But secrecy was now evidence. Structure was now conspiracy. Leadership was now villainy. The trap closes. The spotlight becomes a weapon. By 1935, Dewey was ready. The press was primed. The city was hungry for justice. The jury pool was poisoned by headlines. Luciano was no longer a strategist in the shadows. He was a national symbol of criminal power. Dewey didn't just bring charges. He brought a story. A story where Luciano was the spider at the center of a national underworld web. A story where every vice, every crime, every secret whispered in New York traced back to him. A story the public believed before the trial even began. Luciano had won wars against gangsters. But this enemy played a different game. A game where guilt could be constructed, where influence could be weaponized, and where the strongest man could be outmaneuvered by a headline. For the first time, Luciano understood the terrible irony. He had built an empire too efficient for the underworld, and too visible for the law to ignore. Victory had made him powerful. Power had made him famous. And fame, in the end, made him vulnerable. The courtroom where Lucky Luciano stood trial in 1936 felt less like a place of justice and more like an arena, packed with spectators, buzzing with reporters, and heavy with the expectation that history was about to be made. Flashbulbs cracked like thunder. Headlines were drafted before testimony even began. And at the center of it all sat Luciano, impeccably dressed, expression unreadable, watching as the government attempted to dismantle the empire he once controlled with silence and strategy. The king of the underworld had been dragged into the light. And the world waited to see if he would break. A circus in session. Dewey sets the stage. Prosecutor Thomas Dewey entered the trial with a singular purpose: transform Luciano from a shadowy strategist into the public face of organized vice. Dewey's opening argument was less about law and more about mythology. He painted Luciano as the mastermind behind prostitution, the hidden ruler of brothels across New York, a man whose influence corrupted institutions from the streets to City Hall. It didn't matter that Luciano had never set foot in half the establishments mentioned. It didn't matter that his involvement was strategic, not direct. Dewey wasn't prosecuting facts, he was prosecuting perception. And perception in 1936 was already guilty. Witnesses in fear, stories shaped by pressure. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Brothel madams, frightened prostitutes, former associates looking for leniency. Their stories were emotional, sensational, and often inconsistent. But consistency was not Dewey's strategy. The prosecution didn't need precision. It needed impact. Some claimed Luciano ordered weekly payments. Some insisted he visited brothels personally. Others said his men controlled every room in the city. The defense highlighted contradictions, questioned credibility, and pointed out the absence of direct evidence. But Dewey knew exactly what he was doing. He had chosen witnesses the public would sympathize with, women who appeared vulnerable, exploited, terrified. Every tear shed reinforced Dewey's narrative. Luciano wasn't just a criminal, he was a tyrant hiding behind wealth and charisma. Media frenzy, guilty in the headlines before, in court outside the courthouse. Newspapers turned the trial into spectacle. King of Vice on trial. Luciano's empire of sin exposed. Dewey takes on America's most powerful gangster. Reporters sketched his face with predatory detail. The calm eyes, the clenched jaw, the slight smirk that could be read as confidence or contempt. Every gesture became insinuation. Every silence became evidence. Luciano, who had mastered invisibility for years, now found himself trapped inside a narrative he couldn't escape. The more he stayed silent, the more the public filled the silence with damning assumptions. For the first time, silence was not power. It was prison. Luciano's psychological battle. A leader forced to watch throughout the trial, Luciano maintained composure. He rarely whispered to his attorneys. He showed no anger when witnesses exaggerated or lied. He didn't flinch when prosecutors painted him as a monster. But inside he was fighting a war unlike any he'd faced. In the streets he understood the rules. In the boardrooms of the commission, he guided outcomes with precision. But here, in a courtroom designed to crush him, he was powerless. Control, the one thing he had always possessed, was slipping. The judge chose the rules. Dewey chose the narrative. The newspapers chose the tone. Even the jury seemed chosen by fate to believe the worst. Luciano realized something painful. He wasn't being tried for what he'd done. He was being tried for who he had become, a symbol too dangerous to allow freedom. Dewey's strategy: silence becomes guilt. Dewey exploited every weakness of the mafia's code of omerta. Luciano couldn't call accomplices to defend him. That would violate the very structure he created. He couldn't explain operations without exposing men he swore to protect. He couldn't contradict witnesses without acknowledging details he needed to deny. So he stayed silent. And Dewey used that silence like a weapon. An innocent man, Dewey argued, would speak. A guilty man hides behind walls of silence. Luciano knew the truth was more complicated. Silence was loyalty. Silence was survival. Silence was the only way to avoid implicating others. But in court, silence looked like surrender. The verdict, A. King brought low after weeks of testimony and spectacle. The jury delivered its decision, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in applause as if witnessing a public execution. Dewey became a national hero overnight. Luciano remained still. No flash of anger. No plea. Just the quiet acceptance of a man who finally understood the depth of the trap he'd been pulled into. The judge sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in prison, the harshest penalty ever given for compulsory prostitution. The number wasn't simply punishment. It was symbolic. It was meant to end Luciano's influence forever. But the world underestimated him. The sentence, the beginning of a new battle as guards escorted him away, Luciano felt a strange calm. Yes, the king was in chains. Yes, the empire he built now operated without him. But influence he knew wasn't tied to freedom. Influence lived in loyalty, structure, and the minds of the men he trained. His physical power was gone. But his psychological power remained intact. The courtroom had taken his freedom, but it had not taken his legacy, nor his ability to quietly shape the world he created. And as the doors closed behind him, Lucky Luciano stepped into a new kind of underworld. One without streets, without soldiers, but filled with opportunities for a different kind of control. The king had fallen. But he had not yet surrendered. Prison was supposed to be the end of Lucky Luciano's influence. The courtroom had declared him finished, the newspapers celebrated his downfall, and Thomas Dewey believed he had severed the head of the American underworld. But when Luciano entered Clinton prison, he did not leave his power behind. He simply learned to wield it differently. Behind concrete walls and barbed wire, he faced his greatest test yet: how to lead without being seen, how to influence without being present, and how to remain relevant in a world that moved on without him. A king without a throne, yet still respected. When Luciano arrived in prison, guards expected defiance. Inmates expected arrogance. Instead, he carried himself with the same calm restraint that marked his rise. He didn't demand loyalty. He attracted it. Even in confinement, his reputation preceded him. Whispers spread quickly, "That's Luciano. The man who built the commission. The guy Dewey couldn't break." Convicted criminals admired him. Guards watched him warily. Officials debated whether he still posed a threat. And he did, because Luciano knew that influence wasn't about territory, but about relationships. He observed, listened, waited. Within weeks, he understood the prison's rhythms, its power structure, its hidden economy. He identified who controlled what, who mediated disputes, who manipulated guards. It was, in many ways, simply another system, one he could navigate with the same strategic mindset that shaped the mafia. Coded messages, quiet orders through trusted channels. Luciano refused to let his empire drift into chaos. He used lawyers, visitors, and coded letters to communicate with key figures outside. Messages were disguised as harmless updates, legal discussions, or personal reflections. But within them hid instructions, a shift in leadership, a warning about arrival, a reminder of loyalty, a financial directive. Luciano's orders never sounded like commands. They sounded like suggestions, but everyone understood their weight. His closest allies, especially Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, acted as intermediaries. They maintained alliances, preserved order, and ensured no one attempted to replace him outright. This was Luciano's brilliance. He didn't need presence to maintain control. He needed only structure, and structure was his creation. The emotional burden, watching power slip away, but behind the composed exterior, Luciano faced a private war. In prison, time felt heavier. Decisions took longer to reach him. Rumors arrived distorted. Allies shifted alliances. Rivals gained confidence. New leaders emerged. Luciano felt influence slipping through his fingertips like sand. For a man who had once commanded entire families with a glance, this was agony. His world no longer responded instantly to his mind. The machine he built now operated without him, and sometimes against him. He paced his cell at night, replaying conversations, analyzing reports, imagining the political shifts unfolding far away. He wondered, who is rising while I am locked away? Who is waiting for my absence to grow permanent? What happens when the man who built the system can no longer steer it? Leadership, he discovered, was not about holding power, it was about reinventing the way power moved. Enemies advance. The shadow of Genovese outside prison, one name resurfaced constantly in Luciano's thoughts: Vito Genovese. Ambitious, patient, and opportunistic, Genovese had returned from exile in Italy and immediately sought to fill the vacuum left by Luciano's imprisonment. Genovese understood the commission structure intimately. He respected it, but wanted to reshape it under his rule. Luciano heard rumors of Genovese courting allies, making promises, and reminding others that Luciano's reign was over. The war they never fought openly now evolved into something more subtle. A war of influence fought through whispers and alliances rather than bullets. Genovese's rise reminded Luciano of a painful truth: absence is a dangerous enemy. Every day behind bars strengthened Genovese's position. A new battlefield, collaboration with the U.S. Navy in 1942, a surprising opportunity emerged. The U.S. Navy, shaken by threats of German sabotage on the New York docks during World War II, reached out, discreetly, to the underworld for help. They needed influence. They needed connections. They needed a man whose words still carried weight among dockworkers and union leaders. They needed Luciano. From his prison cell, Luciano provided intelligence, contacts, and assurances that the docks would remain protected. It was a calculated move, not loyalty to America but loyalty to relevance. This collaboration became his greatest strategic reinvention. It proved he still mattered. It reminded the commission of his value. It demonstrated that even behind bars, he could influence events far beyond prison walls. Control redefined, power without freedom. Luciano's prison years transformed him. He learned that leadership didn't require physical presence, only loyalty, structure, and reputation. Influence became a whisper instead of a command. Power became something fluid, not fixed. He no longer chased control through dominance. He maintained it through memory, legacy, and respect. Even as rivals schemed and allies adapted, one truth remained: the system he built still bore his fingerprints, and its stability depended in some invisible way on the man who created it. Luciano entered prison as a king in chains. He remained, even from behind bars, a king in everything but freedom. When Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship in Naples in 1946, he was greeted not with the respect he once commanded in New York, but with curiosity, the kind reserved for a fallen monarch whose legend had arrived long before he did. Italy was his birthplace, yet it felt foreign. The rhythms, the voices, the streets were familiar only in memory. He had been deported not home, but to a museum of his past, while the empire he built continued evolving without him. For the first time in his life, Luciano was a king without a kingdom. A legend in exile, but with no power to match in Italy. Local bosses respected him, but they did not answer to him. Sicilian clans viewed him with caution. Naples offered admiration but not allegiance. Luciano quickly realized a painful truth: his reputation belonged to America, not Italy. There he had built something that required his presence, his voice, his eyes, his quiet authority. Here he was a guest in a world that did not need him. He read American newspapers obsessively. Each headline about mob arrests, political shifts, and commission meetings reminded him of the life he had been forced to leave behind. His mind stayed in New York even as his body aged under the Mediterranean sun. Exile wasn't punishment for his crimes. It was punishment for his success. Attempts to reclaim influence. The Cuban interlude. Luciano refused to accept irrelevance. In 1947, he attempted to revive his influence in the one place close enough to America to matter but distant enough to avoid its laws: Cuba. In Havana he found a spark of the power he once wielded. He met with family leaders, oversaw gambling interests, and acted as mediator between rival factions. For a brief moment it felt like the old days, his word carried weight again. But the moment didn't last. The U.S. government pressured Cuba to expel him. They feared his presence so close to American borders. They feared his potential resurrection. They feared the influence that prison had failed to extinguish. Within months, Luciano was sent back to Italy, closer to the end than the beginning. Watching his empire change, Genovese takes the throne from afar. Luciano watched with growing frustration as Vito Genovese, once his ambitious lieutenant, maneuvered himself into power. Genovese was cunning, ruthless, and patient. He seized opportunities Luciano could no longer even reach. Newspapers described Genovese as the new boss, the head of the commission, and the most powerful gangster in America. Luciano felt each title like a blade. He had created a system to prevent tyrants. He had built a commission meant to diffuse power. Yet in his absence, the vacuum he left drew in a man who embodied everything Luciano tried to eliminate. Letters from allies were polite but distant. Updates from friends were vague. Invitations to provide guidance grew rarer. Luciano had once controlled the direction of an empire. Now he struggled to influence its whispers. Loneliness, the weight of isolation. Luciano lived in modest apartments and simple hotels. He spent hours sitting alone with coffee cooling beside him, replaying decisions from decades earlier. In New York, he had been surrounded by advisors, allies, and enemies. In Italy, he was surrounded by silence. Loneliness was not something he feared as a young man. But now it became the shadow that followed him everywhere. He walked Naples streets anonymously. No one protected him. No one sought his counsel. No one feared him. He had become what he never imagined. A man remembered more than he was respected. Reflection, the price of control and solitude. Luciano confronted the cost of the life he built. He had sacrificed friendships, peace, trust, a home, a future in the city he loved, but the greatest loss was internal. The realization that power, once obtained, reshapes a man permanently. Luciano had risen by reading people, anticipating betrayal, and controlling outcomes. Now in exile, those instincts had nowhere to go. His mind analyzed ghosts. He questioned whether the commission would have been different if he'd been free. Whether Genovese could have risen under his watch. Whether the empire could survive without its architect. His most haunting question was the simplest. Was it worth it? The final years, quiet battles of the mind. As Luciano aged, he received occasional visitors. Old acquaintances, curious journalists, foreign associates seeking advice. He spoke to them with the same calm intelligence that once shaped empires, but inside, he felt the distance between who he had been and who he was now. He became philosophical, reflective. He spoke not of rackets and territory but of choices, loyalty, and the strange fragility of power. One visitor later recalled Luciano saying, "You don't beat life. You negotiate with it. And one day the negotiations end." Luciano's greatest battle was no longer for control of the mafia. It was for peace within himself, a peace he sought but never fully found. A king without a throne, but with a legacy. On January 26, 1962, Luciano collapsed at the Naples airport after meeting with a film producer. His heart had failed, but something deeper had already worn out, the relentless mind of a king forced to rule from exile. He died without territory, without power, without the throne he once commanded. But the empire he built endured. The commission survived. The structure outlived the architect. And in that paradox, losing the world he shaped yet shaping it forever, Luciano fought his final, quiet war. Lucky Luciano died far from the streets where he built his empire, but his influence did not fade with him. It stretched across continents, across decades, across criminal systems that would evolve long after his name was whispered for the last time. What he left behind was not merely a mafia structure. It was a philosophy, a blueprint for power rooted in psychology, diplomacy, and an understanding of human nature that few leaders, criminal or otherwise, ever mastered. His legacy was not marked by how loudly he ruled, but by how quietly the world continued to follow him. The Commission, a government for the underworld. Luciano's greatest achievement was not a crime, but a creation. The Commission, the governing council designed to end wars, settle disputes, regulate profit, and prevent any one man from becoming tyrant over the others. It replaced chaos with structure, revenge with negotiation, dictatorship with collaboration. The Commission functioned like a board of directors. Each family had representation. Disputes were settled through votes. Territory was divided scientifically. Business strategies were coordinated nationally. This model not only prevented the bloodshed that once defined mafia life, it also allowed the organization to expand in ways the old world could never have imagined. Decades later, law enforcement agencies admitted that the Commission was one of the most sophisticated criminal innovations ever created, efficient, resilient, and terrifyingly rational. Even after Luciano's death, the Commission continued operating because it was designed to survive its creator. Diplomacy over violence. The Luciano method. Before Luciano, mafia leadership depended on intimidation, superstition, and rigid hierarchy. After Luciano, power shifted to something far more subtle: diplomacy. He built alliances across ethnic lines, treating Jewish and Irish partners not as outsiders but as equals. He learned to read men like documents, studying their fears, desires, and emotional triggers. Violence became a last resort, not the first answer. Luciano's leadership relied on Listening more than speaking, negotiation over confrontation, psychological leverage instead of brute force, control through opportunity, not fear. These principles did more than stabilize the mafia. They influenced organized crime globally, shaping the dynamics of leadership in ways still recognized today. A true leader, Luciano believed, was not feared for his anger, but respected for his clarity. Decentralization. The secret to longevity. One of Luciano's most enduring contributions was his understanding that power must be spread out to survive. Dictatorships collapse when their leaders fall. Systems endure. Luciano decentralized authority, decision-making, territory control, financial management. He turned families into semi-autonomous units, each responsible for its own prosperity while still operating under the rules of the commission. This prevented internal coups, limited the damage of arrests, and made the mafia resilient against outside pressure. This decentralization became the gold standard for criminal organizations worldwide. Cartels, syndicates, and even extremist groups studied Luciano's structure because it allowed maximum profit with minimum exposure. He had proven something timeless: distributed power is harder to destroy. A psychological blueprint for control. Luciano's legacy was not only structural, it was psychological. He understood people as systems: predictable, emotional, fearful, ambitious. His leadership style, quiet, deliberate, always calibrated, became a template for how modern organized crime views authority. From him came rules still followed today. Never show all your strength, never reveal your fears, keep your enemies useful, keep your friends slightly uncertain, control information, and you control outcomes. Luciano ruled not through domination, but through perception. He made himself indispensable without appearing power-hungry. He created stability without demanding devotion. This mastery of emotional subtlety reshaped the culture of the mafia and influenced criminal psychology for generations. Influence beyond the mafia, the global ripple. Luciano's innovations did not remain confined to New York. They traveled. In Sicily, the mafia's governing body, the cupola, mirrored the commission. In Japan, the Yakuza adopted similar council-based leadership methods. In Hong Kong and Taiwan, triads refined decentralization strategies. In South America, cartels structured themselves with tiered management and regional autonomy. Luciano had shown the world that a criminal empire could function like a corporation: organized, strategic, sustainable. And criminal networks across the globe embraced his methods because they worked. His blueprint outlived not only him but every boss who succeeded him. The quiet war that never ended. Luciano's greatest struggle was never the wars he fought or the enemies he eliminated. It was the internal war, the psychological cost of maintaining power in a world where trust could kill him. The quiet war that shaped his life now shapes modern criminal leaders. The fear of losing control, the weight of loyalty, the paranoia of leadership, the loneliness of command. These emotional truths became part of the culture he created, embedded into the DNA of organized crime. His legacy is not just structural. It is psychological. It is human. What Luciano truly left behind. Lucky Luciano didn't just modernize the mafia. He rewrote the rules of power. He proved that leadership comes not from force but from understanding. Not from fear but from structure. Not from dominance but from strategy. And though he died without a throne, the empire he designed still stands. Proof that the quiet mind of a single man can alter the destiny of countless others. Luciano left behind buildings made not of stone, but of systems, decisions, psychology, and influence. His legacy is the underworld's greatest paradox. The king who lost everything, yet still shapes the world he can no longer touch.